and welcome to Varn Blog. And today we're talking with Camilo Gomez and our third on the series of Pedro Castillo's presidency. Last time we talked, we were in the long interim before the official results were, I guess, officialized. I'm trying to think of the right word for that. But nonetheless, Pedro Castillo is now president of Peru and has appointed a cabinet. And Camilo and I thought that we'd learn more about the possible direction of the Castillo presidency for Peru by the nature of the cabinet. I always talk about when I lost faith in Barack Obama was when he appointed his cabinet in 2008, 2009. And I think the cabinet in Peru is, frankly, a little bit more interesting and wild than I thought. But I don't know local politics enough to fully interpret it. And that is why Camilo is with us. So, was the cabinet an indication of Castillo's left-wing agenda? Is there something else? Should we see concessions to like the internet, to the IMF, or anything in cabinet appointments? What are we seeing?
Yeah, I think it is much more mixed than I think some expected. Some expected much more moderation. Others expected much more radicalization. I think it is not a middle point, but actually a very kind of weird mix. The cabinet has changed a little bit and could probably change another position, but probably most are going to stay. I think the curious thing is that one of the early appoints in the cabinet was Héctor Béjar, who was actually a guerrilla fighter in the 60s. And is very controversial, but he has taught at the CAEM, which is the Center for Higher Studies, Higher Military Studies. So in Peru there are three armed forces, like I think most countries, with some exceptions, but like the military, like the army, which is generally the one that has seen more progressive. So he taught there. He was a professor in the graduate school there, and he is a sociologist and has been a professor after his revolutionary attempts in the 60s.
Can I ask you a question about that?
Yeah.
In the United States, if you were to say that the military, the army in specific, was the most progressive branch of the military, we'd look at you like you were crazy. So why is the military considered the army considered such a progressive part of the military?
I think that because it's most of it's kind of more decentralized in a way that neither the Navy or the Air Force is, and because obviously for the Navy has like in the ports, but also so some fluvial areas, but not all parts have fluvial areas. So obviously there are not everywhere. Also with the Air Force they have to have some kind of a facility like it's not even airplanes, but basically like places where basically some helicopter could land at least, to have some kind of facilities, but in the Air Force it will be everywhere. Like, and I think that has led that is much more of a working of many much more from a working class background come, and it's in that way has been considered as more progressive, and Velasco,
so the officers are more likely to actually come from the soldiery and from working class backgrounds, period.
It's slightly more than in the Navy or the Air Force. The Navy is even more conservative than the Air Force. There actually had some people that end up becoming basically left communists, actually. But that's another story that could end up.
That's wild. We'll come back to that. But to get back to the cabinet member we were talking about, I'll let you pick that back up. It's just I think Americans would have found that the assertion that the army was progressive to be strange.
Yeah, but I think it plays the issue with which in Peru is called the terruqueo, which is the kind of accusing of someone of being a terrorist, and he was accused of being a terrorist for making the statement that the Navy started the terrorism, and people say like the Navy started and not the Shining Path. But I think what he was referring was that the Navy had planned basically a counter coup in the 70s against Velasco Alvarado, but they tried to distort it, and he was the first to get out, and he was kind of the more radical. But the curious thing is that he was appointed, by the way, as Minister of Foreign Relations, which is a curious position, and he basically the Group of Lima is dead basically now. So the Group of Lima, for those that don't know, is the organization that wanted to create dialogue with Venezuela, but now like the dialogue is in DC between Venezuela and the opposition, which I think Latin American countries no longer have any say on that. But the curious thing is that the chancellor, the new chancellor, the new kind of Minister of Foreign Relations is Oscar Murtua, who is a much more moderate, and he has been Minister of Foreign Relations with Alejandro Toledo, who was a center-right president. So he's not a radical, but he seems that he has understood that the government is moving to the left, and that like he's not going to try to please I wouldn't say the right, because at that time there wasn't like that much ideological dispositions in foreign policy, but I think he has taken a much more moderate approach. And the cabinet, the president is Guido Bellido, who is seen as a strong ally, more than Castillo of Cerrón, who is the president of Castillos Party, and he has been very questioned, and particularly recently because of some of sexist remarks. And he has also been accused of being pro-terrorist because of some vague Facebook posts. But I think it's the issue with the terruqueo, that everyone is accused of being a supporter of terrorism. Even like one congressman from the party of Fernando Soto in campaign was accused of being a terrorist. So it doesn't like matter. Like, and he's a right-wing libertarian. Like, why a right-wing libertarian will be a Shining Path supporter? Like, it doesn't make any kind of sense.
Is there any substance to the allegation that Ibar was tied to the Shining Path?
Who of them?
Excuse me. Who are we speaking about right now? Ibar Maravi.
Yeah, no, that's the other minister.
Okay, so I'm getting my confused because they seem to be accusing a lot of the cabinet of being terrorists. So
yeah, but as I mentioned, the accusing campaign a right-wing libertarian of being a terrorist. I mean, yeah, it doesn't make any sense, and he's pretty young. Like, doesn't even make a timeline.
So okay, so just to remind our audience who might be coming in, because our numbers are growing as we watch, as we talk here, which cabinet minister are we talking about at this moment who is no longer under consideration or has been replaced?
The one that we are talking about, we talk in the recent minutes. It's Sector Bejar, who was kind of the more radical and has.
He was a cabinet member for what?
for Minister of Foreign Relations.
Okay, Minister of Foreign Relations. He came out of the army. All right, so
he came out of the army, but he was a professor in the kind of army
army college,
army grad school, and actually, like, that's the issue, because like he pointed out that that's the vision that some people in the military have. Like some people in the military think that the war is about at least the leadership of the of the Navy. So there are kind of internal. So with the Guido Castillo, I don't think the kind of accusations are convincing in any kind of even vague sense. But with other members, it's much more unclear, because the accusations are from the 80s. So it is complex. With Iber Marami, it seems like they could be more links. But the issue is, at one point, people from rural Peru all were suspected to be terrorists. So that is the issue. He has put his charge on consideration. So I think he could be removed by the president now, and probably he will. My intuition is that whatever his responsibility or not, I think kind of it's pretty difficult for the government to maintain him at this point, and they are searching for a new minister of work.
Yes, he's the minister of Mount is the minister of labor. Who accused him of being a former member or supporter of Shining Path?
Well, the press. I think the press, as we have talked, is fairly right wing and accuses basically everyone of being a terrorist. As I had mentioned before, like there are some elements within the left that actually are much more libertarian in a broad way that right wing libertarians. And I think in a fair way they are also more. It is strange to say it, but in some ways they also have a more anti-Shining Path streak that even some members of the right, because the issue is that while the right has been calling everyone a terrorist, they don't want to investigate the current assassinations in the Bram, which is an area that has been linked to the MPCP, which is an offshoot of the Shining Path, but with most people believe is basically at this point just a narco cartel. And to continue with this cabinet, like I think the interesting thing about this cabinet is that despite it has many people that have like the press is accusing of this, I think the case of Maravi is complex to say whether he is or not. But in the other cases, the accusations like are very vague. I mean, like, because they are related to somebody like. But there was a presidential candidate like Johnny Lascano was from a center-right party whose brother was actually condemned by being an actual member of Shining Path, and since he was in a party that centrist was mostly from the center-right, they were kind of shoot about that. So it doesn't like. I think it's true that some people within the party of Castillo have say statements that are really very dangerous, and I think that, but they are not necessarily elected, and it's like not that Castillo is going to control everything like every member of the party says.
Right. So just for people who are catching up, what is Castillo's party? And we've talked about this on another episode. People can check it out. But Castillo's party is somewhat Marxist-Leninist, but Castillo actually is not really from that main line. He's often at odds with the president of the general secretary of the party, right?
Yeah, actually, the Castillo had a plan to run, and create his own party. But when the pandemic started, obviously, like the recollection firms, so signatures, like the signature process, the inscriptions, everything become complex. And the leader of the party, the founder of the party was Vladimir Cerrón, who was a fairly controversial politician that has been accused of corruption and couldn't run, like basically selected Castillo. But I think the important thing here is that Castillo was not a member of his party, so he could have selected a loyalist in some way, but he selected Pedro Castillo was much more independent-minded and had a much more kind of populist streak that Vladimir Cerrón lacked. And I think that's the important issue. I think to discuss some other members of the cabinet, I think they're really interesting in the sense like Pedro Franque, for example, is I guess a social democrat. So in that sense, it's not that left wing, but he's a social democrat that has been moderating itself. Like he was a fairly left leaning social democrat at one point, and now it's a kind of a much more moderate social democrat at this point. But I think he is trying to maintain a lot of the issues. He wants the president of the Reserve Bank of Peru to stay, which is he wants to more or less like and the budgets have been announced and the budgets have been are fairly fairly conventional in many ways, a little bit more decentralized than before, but fairly conventional. It's not so in macroeconomic terms. I don't think Peru is going to change that much. It's not someone who it's not a kind of a much more left-wing kind of politician that some could have expected. On health, the Minister of Health, Hernando Ceballos, also someone who comes from other party in the left-wing coalition from Land and Freedom, which is technically an eco-socialist party but in reality included a very huge coalition of different kind of sectors, including several Trotskyist tendencies within. So I guess like the opposition between the Land and Freedom and Together for Peru was that the Land for Freedom had kind of the Trotskyists and Together for Peru was the other left-wing party, had the communists, like the
Marxist-Leninist line.
Yeah, the CP, like the CP of a Russian orientation in some ways.
Right, got it.
Soviet, and the CP of the Chinese orientation, but that has kind of doubled down on Maoism with time. Yeah, so he's left wing, but he's I think compared to other ministers of health, I don't think he's to be that ideological. Vaccinations are going up. At this point, 25% of the population have been vaccinated. Peru started relatively late compared to other countries. I think the numbers will grow fairly fast, hopefully. But the positive thing is both the number of cases and the number of deaths are slowing, are becoming much lower.
Have you been hit hard by Delta variant in the same way as other parts of the world?
No.
Okay.
Although an interesting issue is that there is not that much genetic research in Peru, and that's problematic because. But the issue is that it's curious. In most countries, Delta variant has replaced the original variants. But the Lambda variant, which is the one that exists here in Peru and other areas of the Andes, seems to still be strong and not have been removed by the Delta variant. So in that sense, there is some hope, and it seems that a lot of corruption that was going on in the previous administration is being kind of combated now, and I think that's important. And the Minister of Education is, I think, someone, and I think a development in many ways, because it's Juan Carillo. He he was elected as one of the best teachers in the world by a global organization. He's a teacher by training, but study informatics engineering in order to develop techniques to teach kids with technology. And he's a fairly smart guy. I think he is probably the smartest person in the cabinet, and he's a rural teacher, which is something that could surprise many people. He's not a bureaucrat, but he's a lot of people have said that the Peru Libre is unwoke, and I in fairness, he's not a member of Peru Libre, but he is, I don't know if to use the term woke, but he is much more conventional, pro gender approach in education, fighting against sexism, homophobia, transphobia, forms of discrimination.
So this is Castillo making a. It's a sign that Castillo is making outreach to the more conventional urban, cultural as well as economic left, which is not Castillo's base, which is from the American and even urban South American standpoint, seems very conservative on issues of like sexual reproduction and stuff like that.
The curious issue is that he's a rural teacher, so he's not. So
this is not. He's not an urban leftist, but
but I think as someone who has relatives that are teachers, someone have said like teachers in Peru become like amateur anthropologists because they notice the difference. Like from town to town, like people are different, and they have a lot of very kind of complex stories, and they understood the value of diversity. And I think that's one of the reasons why the teachers unions have leaned very strongly to the left in a lot of parts of Latin America, because they understood diversity, maybe not in necessarily in the way that the diversity is framed in other parts, but they understand that obviously like kind of thinking in one way, that the student is one thing and the student is many things. And I think that's something really, really curious. Another minister, which is more curious even, is Anaí Durán, who is the Minister of Women. And she's she's a feminist, an openly feminist. She's much more to left than most of the cabinet, and she has been questioned because like her former partner was involved in the far left in Chile, and but she has broke with him many years ago, and I think it's fairly unfair to kind of make like assumptions because of a relation from many years ago, and I think it shows the complexity of the cabinet. Another important character is Dina Boluarte, who was the vice president, the presidential candidate, has been considered a Cerrón loyalist, but by some journalists, it's more clear that is less loyalist now. The rest of the cabinet seems to be more Cerrón loyalists or people loyal to Castillo. It's not clear what we know about them. But actually, the cabinet was very nearly removed by Congress, and actually,
I was just gonna say it was almost completely pulled by Congress, and the cabinet has to be approved by Congress in Peru, correct?
Yeah, so that's the issue, and I think the important thing is that the right, as always, has if the left is fairly poorly planned and very chaotic, the right is even more chaotic, because like when the prime minister spoke in Quechua, he was the right was protesting in parliament, and kind of that was some argue it was a symbolic victory, but I don't think it was symbolic. I think it was an expression of indigenous speakers speaking in the wrong way, like and 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 try to kind of express their way of being, like and say that this is how a lot of people that don't speak Spanish have feel for a lot of time in a Congress that generally has been monolingual, in the sense of just speaking Spanish. So
Can I
think,
ask you a question? How much of Peru does not speak Spanish as their primary language? I know Quechua is spoken widely, but what percentage of the population speak Quechua like natively? Do you know?
I don't know Quechua exactly, but as the people that don't have Spanish as their native language is 30%.
Okay, so but that's big. That's not an insignificant group of people. Okay, got it. Thank you. Continue. Sorry. Just
Yeah.
I sometimes think the audience doesn't know much. I mean, I will be honest with you, Camilo. Even though I have dated someone from Peru, I am always shocked about how much I don't know about it, and I know Latin America much better than most gringos. So I am. So if I am trying to follow you, I'm gonna slow you down and ask you to explain, because I know my audience has no idea what you're talking about. So
Yeah, I think it is quite complex looking at Peru, and I think like what you mentioned about the reading of the election within the kind of the that it was read to a very racial angle. The election itself. I think it has become much more racial in the aftermath, because I think the right has had a very bad strategy of trying to be racist. For example, like they argue that the prime minister that has dyed his hair of red, and actually the prime minister is a natural redhead. I mean, he looks indigenous, but he's a redhead, and that's why he was known as Puca, which means red in Quechua, and it's because obviously indigenous populations have, with exceptions in general, at least by the genetic research of the people in some parts of the highlands between Peru and Bolivia, and some parts of the frontier between Mexico and Guatemala. Like with those exceptions, most population, even if indigenous, have mixed to some degree, and that's
so most
why
people are mestizo, basically.
In some ways there is, but in other ways the identities are very complex. Okay. Because it's not that it's half or half. Like as I mentioned with the example of crypto Jews, there are crypto Jews whose probably its ancestry could be very far away, but the idea of they being of Jewish descent is a central part of their identity, and I think it is curious because when people talk about Quechua, the expansion of Spanish has and the education system has made people stopping speaking Quechua, but also has made people stopping speaking what in Selendín, which is a province within the region of Cajamarca in northern Peru, which is the region from Pedro Castillo, but Pedro Castillo is not from that province, but the province more to the north. Apparently, at least by the research of the historian, of the French historian Nathan Bactel, at least at the early 20th century, some people spoke a kind of hybrid language between Spanish and Hebrew, but
Ladino.
Something like that. And it seems that with education it vanished, because probably teachers were kind of confused at what they are saying, and just they say say the things like they say in other parts, and that's why I think some people think that Peruvians have a more standardized Spanish, because there were so many variants that there was the need to kind of make a language that works to kind of.
So yeah, the national project had to homogenize the language, kind of like they did in Spain itself, right? Like to make it very similar. I will say, as a person who speaks really terrible Spanish, Peruvian Spanish is easy to understand. Peruvian Spanish, Argentine Spanish. I understand Mexican Spanish, but it's because I live there and only in the north. So, but if you listen to someone who speaks like Bolivian Spanish or one of the like Dominican or Cuban Spanish, I have no idea what they're saying, like none. So my anecdotal story is I can see that from that there was a highly imposed standardization of language just from the way people talk, because it is very consistent and very standard. When I listen to Peruvians, the slang is limited. It's pretty easy to follow. There's also not as many indigenous words like there are in some other Latin American dialects of Spanish. Like Mexico is full of indigenous words.
Yeah, there are, but yeah, I mean, and the curious thing is that it reminds me what you were talking in a previous episode of the podcast with Cuba, because of Poland, because in Poland more or less that happened, because they even the Kashubians and like kind of this regional. So for example, the Poles in Brazil still are used to speak the dialects. They didn't spoke the modern Polish.
Yeah, it's similar to German. If you're one of the German-speaking communities in the United States, in Pennsylvania and Ohio, they speak a very old form of German that is not standard to modern German. So this happens all over the world. I think it's interesting that Peru went that way, as opposed to like, I don't know, Uruguay or someplace that incorporated the largest indigenous language into the education system. Do you think there's a chance that Quechua might be taught in schools in any significant amount?
Maybe that's a possibility. I think that what came out of this kind of impeachment process was kind of the need of an intercultural vision, and I think in that was kind of what weakened the hand of the right that wanted to impeach, and I think that has led to a lot of complexities. The right still complains and wants to remove some ministers. Though to be honest, it seems some ministers are not necessarily know that much about their charge. They're not the specialists in the position they have been appointed. So it's not clear like where things are going to change that much. But on issues like economy, education, and health, it seems that and justice also, like Aníbal Torres, who is a fairly moderate. So the cabinet was at the end approved, like it wasn't removed, and I think that's a really interesting step. Although like the criticisms kind of continue. There is obviously a judicial process against Keiko Fujimori. So it's going to be complex. Like I think that there is a possibility that both the president of Pedro Castillo's party, Vladimir Cerrón, and the person who was the right wing, the far right candidate at this point, because like she has basically ditched any kind of moderation that she had at one point. Keiko Fujimori have there is a possibility both end up in jail, and in that case, I think it is complex what the panorama is going to be, because in some ways Castillo kind of what some people argue is not, Castillo is not really governing because like is Keiko moving everything, or Cerrón is even playing against him because like Castillo is not that left wing, and or that at least what Cerrón argues. But the issue with Keiko is very curious because she actually has recently recognized the results, and kind of for moments she tries to moderate, her rhetoric as being right wing, just more conventionally. For moments, like she tries to sound far right, and it's.
So she tried to pull a Trump, basically, and then back down. Is that the way we are to understand it?
Kind of pull a Trump without, but not in office. So
But
that's
yeah, so pull a Trump, but not like, but never having actually gotten into office in the first place. Got it.
Yeah, it's a. So I think her party is moving much more to the far right. I think, and I think on those spaces, I think like kind of the Peruvian Bolsonaro, who has been the leader of other party, has a much more viable chances in the future to be a stronger contender rather than she, which I think even if she at this point fits the far right description, she's kind of more back down in some ways. It tries not to be as unhinged as the other, and I think the far right one's kind of unhinged as a kind of the Trumpianism in some way, like not moderate, like say like kind of crazy stuff, and I think the obviously like the cabinet is controversial, and recently, as I mentioned, Guido Bellido, the president of cabinet, has been questioned by making sexist remarks, but it's quite curious because I think that that in some ways, despite all the sound, and a very recent Moody's report, like Moody's the financial, with this financial risk reports, points out that Peru has been like continuing, like it has slowed it has increased its financial risk of investing in Peru. But it's not just because of Castillo; it's because of all the kind of elements within the political system that has led to kind of a political instability. So people from not just uh, from the left, but the left was very small in the last Congress, and despite that, the right approved a lot of populist measures, and despite that, they lost election because like not necessarily populism is that popular in its right wing form in Peru. Which I think there are a lot of reasons why, but it's very eclectical, and I think in some ways Castillo was able to appeal to a much wider range of the middle in a weird way, and I think in some ways, even if the discussion of the Constitution is kind of doubling down, I think the curious issue is Pedro Castillo is kind of talking about an anti-discrimination constitution, and I think that's a really interesting element because the kind of discussion about sexism and homophobia and transphobia is leading to kind of a discussion of inclusion. Like I don't think necessarily like the an important segment of Peru Libre is particularly those are the central issues that they hold, and as for some elements of the right, that is the kind of central elements, the kind of more opposition to social issues than really the economics. But I do think there could be some change, but I'm not that optimist. I think the government, if something seems to go in a very chaotic way, and I think both the opposition as well as the governing party are chaotic in itself, and they're very factional within itself. I think that there is a very in some ways, like the non being impeached the cabinet makes one thing that there is a possibility of seeing a stronger and a stronger government in some ways, but at the same time, Castillo seems like some argue that Castillo it looks like he's campaigning and wants to challenge people now to debates and things like that. But in some ways, I think he enjoys really like being in touch more with the with the people rather than with politicians or the press, because like the press just wants to ask them about like kind of the controversial elements within his party and not about or his cabinet and his appointments, and not about the policies. I think on education Juan Cadillo has talked about very important reforms that could lead to some important developments. So Peru, for example, in PISA test has at this point is very basically equal to Argentina, which is quite impressive considering that Argentina.
That is impressive, considering the difference in socioeconomic background. Right, Argentina is a richer country.
Yeah, and actually like urban-rural divide. The kids go to school much less. A lot of much more complexity still exists in Peru, and the fact that it has been able with very mild reforms to kind of basically being equal that Argentina in the PISA test show that modest reforms can lead to improvements, and the attempt of his role now in the Ministry of Education is really hopeful in some ways. But at the same time, I think that the issue is that it is complex, because particularly because of the university, like the I think in from elementary to high school, it could be improvements, and maybe even in pre-K, like I guess kindergarten we call it here, but at the same time, universities seem a much more complex process. Sometimes like people joke about universities being medieval institutions, but in Peru they literally are. I mean, many of the oldest university was actually a seminary, and that's why it's called like the National University of San Marcos, which is where I study. Of San Marcos, the name of a saint. And I think it's curious because I think now the chaplain of Harvard is an atheist, and I think San Marcos has a very left-wing reputation, but I doubt they could name an atheist chaplain. I think the really important issue, I think in the element of universities, that it hasn't changed that much. Like the structure is 5 years, and it's 300 grades at least, and it's like some careers ask for 300 or 400, basically, like in medicine, like more than 400 grades. So it's 9 years. And it's fairly complex because most of the courses are mandatory. So if you fail one course, you're gonna have a diploma even if you finish your 5 years. Like you have to take that course again. If you fail, you take it again, and if you fail 3 times, you're kicked out. And so like that's, and I think that's generally in Latin America. Which is why explains why Latin America has very few university graduates, because it's of its complexity, and I think that's a very kind of a curious thing. Now the change in education that Castillo has been talking is removing the entry exam. So the curious thing in Peru is that sometimes I hear people that say that they study humanities because they were bad at math, but in Peru, if you're bad at math, you cannot study humanities, for a very simple reason. Any university has its own exam, and generally the universities that have so the universities that have more difficult exams are public universities because they are free, and so obviously more apply, and the only one other that have like that have humanities are the Catholic universities, who are generally tougher than the regular private universities are, although there are very few, like not that much Catholic universities. There are more Catholic schools as like elementary to high school, but as universities there are not that much. So the curious thing is you probably need to actually be good to study humanities. Well, not that good, but at least like you have to on principle pass a mathematics test that is more difficult than the mathematics test that someone who is going to study engineer but a private university, which could sound weird, but that's kind of the reality. And some countries have, like Chile done a kind of universal exam. So you like something like an state based SIT, like a Chilean SIT. But what Peru, like Castillo, is proposing is abolishing the exam, and some argue that's a very populist policy, because the issue is, to be frank, there are in hard science and in other kind of more STEM fields, there are some positions that are not, they're, they require someone with higher training in STEM. And for example, in biochemistry, and people who get a better job in the pharmaceutical industry, and it's like jobs that are quite lucrative even for a recent graduate. And sometimes they don't even ask for a PhD. So that's the complexity. I mean, like, there are literally at this point some departments that are not filled out, like in the STEM, because there are not really that many people wanting that positions, and but promising like free entry to the universities. It's complex because in some ways the ones that could be more positions, like where humanities and social science, are curiously like also like fields where there are not that many people that want to study those. So it's fairly complex, like what's going to be the possibilities there. So the health sector is also very problematic because of its structure. Despite the minister, also there is someone that is really interesting. It's basically divided. There is a public health that is functional, that it depends on the on the on your salary, and there is kind of an emergency care that is basically what people are afforded if they don't have a private insurance. Also, the private insurance kind of don't want to recognize the for example, they have tried to deny care for COVID-19, and kind of it's complex. So I think Peru is a perfect example of why letting like a private based system in healthcare is not necessarily optimal. I think the host of Econ Talk, which is actually a libertarian podcast, was making the case for universal healthcare from a libertarian position, because it's very difficult to defend it. Like like from like there are a lot of market distortions. Not that like the hospital administrators are like kind of like there are a lot of information that is not available, and like kind of this problem of kind of control. It's fairly complex. I mean, even some of the more prestigious clinics are in trouble because they are dealing with logistics problems that they didn't deal before. So maybe in kind of winter there were more respiratory problems generally, but obviously, like with the pandemic, it's something that reached levels that it hasn't seen before. And I think it is quite complex there, that position too. The within the other sector, I think is important, which is justice. The reform depends that the judges are removed, and that's very complex. I remember one member of the Supreme Court once, quote unquote, disappeared, and he was found out. Like people thought that, like he since he was seeing a lot of corruption cases, like people thought that, someone has killed him. Oh, poor guy, but actually the police found him in a brothel. like yeah, it's kind of a surreal case of and in theory he had traveled to make an audience of some or something, and it was kind of yeah, it was surreal. And much of those cases, I mean, like, are really almost surreal. Like the corruption that there is in the justice system doesn't depend that much on the minister, because the issue very clear is that, like, drug trafficking generates a lot of the corruption, and a lot of the system is ingrained in that corruption. So it's very difficult to see how much he could do a reform on the Ministry of women. It's difficult, because I do feel that while the center of Peru Libre is not being anti-woke, as some people think overseas, I don't think it's being woke either. I think it's a complex challenge, and I think, like, now that people are talking about abortion, I think abortion is a very difficult discussion, because I think on some way I see a much more viable path for gay rights, or even recognition of transgender rights, which will sound like strange in some way, but in the sense that, like, in the gay pride marches, you see a lot of old women, like, marching and with banners that say my song is gay and I'm proud, and things like that. So it is curious, but in some ways, like, Peru resembles a little bit of Spain, because um, there was a recent poll, and the and the country that was less transphobe was Spain, which, on principle, one wouldn't think it's much woke than other countries, quote unquote woke. But I think it is because with its family is like, like, they are inclusive. The question was, if relative is trans, will you be fine? And yeah, most of the people were kind of fine. And the curious case, that the most transphobic country wasn't the UK, as some expected, but France. And so yeah, I think in that way, I think in some ways, in strange ways, I think there is a place to convey homophobia and transphobia. But at the same time, like, with abortion, it's a much more difficult issue, because I do think it is complex. I think some feminists argue that at this point the approach should be an emergency approach, like, try to focus on abortions for rape, for some particular rape to minors, which sadly is common, and generate a lot of unwanted pregnancies, and many teenage girls not finishing high school. And as I mentioned before, like, the Peruvian economy is fairly informal, and not having a high school degree is basically the basic requirement to have any formal job. So it's almost impossible for them to have a formal job, and kind of, like, what's their future beyond being a street vendors? Not as much, because sadly, like, there's not a safety net of any sort, and that's a very complex issue. So they have to depend on their families, and that generates a lot of complexities. And I think it is quite curious that the issue of abortion. I think there is a lot of complexity in this issue. Despite that, I think the ministry is going to be have a pro-abortion view. I think it resembles a challenge. I think there is some support to the idea of some kind of decriminalization, but a full decriminalization, I don't know how well it could gain support.
So, I mean, obviously the Catholic country thing changes this perspective, and I understand that while Catholicism is declining in all of South America, it still set the cultural norms. I mean, I was surprised at how controversial abortion was in Mexico, and gay rights weren't that controversial at all. Actually, I mean, they weren't. They were. Well, I mean, they were, but not any more than the United States at the same time period. You know, we were talking 2013, 2014, 2015. So, you know, it is interesting what sticks and what doesn't. I have a couple of issues. You mentioned that the United States reading of the election as racial was misguided, but that this has changed after the election, that the right has tried to pick up racial talking points. You seem to imply that was out of desperation. Like, you just don't have anything to talk about. Right-wing populism is not doing well. Libertarianism is seemingly, not beloved right now, particularly in the healthcare sector and education. What do you think? Do you think this racial narrative may stick around for a while, given the indigenous issues in Peru, or do you think it's going to? This is just a cry for desperation, and the right will have to go back to its old talking points very soon. What do you think is going to happen there?
Well, the complexity here is that I think the racialization of politics in Latin America will have very different effects in different countries. So in some countries could have a very different effect. But the issue is that Peru is 90% non-white. So 90% of the population don't identify as white. That despite the narrative that, some neoliberals in the 90s tried to more or less import the color blindness, but in a weird way, like saying that if people are integrated to the market, they're going to become white. But that was
so capitalists are white.
Something like that. But the curious thing about that was the particular an area which strongly supported Castillo was Puno. And Puno has a significant Aymara presence. I think people generally associate Aymara with Bolivia, but they have an important presence in Peru. And there are some Aymara populations also in Chile and Argentina, and some immigrants from Aymara background in Brazil, although that was not originally an Aymara territory. It was like the ones of the Tiahuanaco was kind of the expansion of the Aymara. Oh, the early expansion, then there were other kind of political formations. But the Aymara, for example, are known for their very strong ethnic identity, and at the same time an ethnic identity that has a very strong sense of rebellion against the government, so very anarchic, but at the same time very, very friendly to the market, kind of this reputation of them being kind of counterfeiters in the sense of bringing a lot of products from different parts, and this reputation comes from Potosism, from colonial times. Taking the silver out of in a kind of clandestine way out of the Spanish Empire. But I think that the racial politics are quite complex, because in some way the narrative, to some degree, even if not necessarily the completely, but in urban areas, like, still, I think the right has support, and even among the non-white population, because I think there is a kind of anti-communist streak that seems to be working. I think the idea of the emerging classes has some appeal within the coastal urban areas, but outside of it, its appeal is much more limited. Although, to be fair, Lima has 1/3 of the population, so that's not something minimal. But also, to be fair, it seems that Congress, which is Peru Libre doesn't have the majority, so the right has an important presence there, just doing a fairly bad job, and it seems like the right is kind of losing support. So I think, I don't know what they are going to do. I think in some ways the narrative is being lost to some degree, but at the same time, the government seems to be different factions fighting each other. So it's not clear where. I mean, it was curious, the accusations against like kind of Guido Bellido of sexism, the current premier, because it's probably that they were true, and given that he makes a lot of like kind of not polished statements, but the curious thing is that like the Fujimorismo is accused of forced realization. So talking about sexism, well, sexism like obviously forces sterilizing Indigenous and women in the Andes and poor women in urban areas, not like kind of if that's not sexism, what that is, like obviously sexism, racism, and it was in some ways a form of eugenics, and even a pro-life think tank who broke the story, like, call it the larger eugenics project since the end of the Cold War. So it's not a minor thing. So I think Fujimorism has which had a very strange outlook, and I think that's curious, because like when people talk about state capacity, they in some ways Fujimorism represents a bigger state than the previous governments, but Fujimorism was the government that bring the roads and also sterilized women. So it kind of I think this builds on what Natalie Smith mentioned, in your previous podcast about the EMF guy. The interesting thing about that is that I think that it wasn't that criticized, because when not necessarily the World Bank, but there were a lot of institutions, like people don't remember, were very like kind of into eugenics, including the UNESCO. We did a lot of kind of EQ tests, things like that. We were very weird, and because of that, the OECD, which technically is more economic, is the one that does the PISA test, because UNESCO, like it's weird. Like the people that make reference to UNESCO generally are more to the right than the people that make more statements with the PISA test, despite that people on the imaginary one will think one organization is more left-leaning and the other more right-leaning. But I think that in some ways one could see that epistemic communities have been changing, and I think at least in the 90s there was I think it's not a surprise. I mean, if someone reads the history of Central Europe, for example, Czechoslovakia, like also did forced sterilizations against Roma women within the communist government, and then when there was a neoliberal government. So in some ways, kind of epistemic communities kind of broke, but some stay. In the case of the World Bank, like Pedro Franque is probably some of the more woke within the government. In a more conventional sense, he's a professor of economics at a private university, at a Catholic university that has a quite liberal reputation. So I don't know, Georgetown, something like that. It's equivalent, I guess. But I think it is complex. But in some ways, the left was taken by surprise, the kind of more urban left, and I think they are trying to rethink. But at the same time, I do feel some elements within the far right are kind of tempting to support Castillo in a weird way, because they feel that Castillo represents kind of a broke with the NGO left, like, which is kind of curious, because generally that's what people on the far right accuse NGOs of conspiracies. So there's that. Yeah, I think there's that.
Okay. Well, thank you for some of the stuff. I have one last question, and then I'll let you go. What do we take? How is Congress going to interface with the Castillo government? We've already had the possible invalidation of the cabinet, but it got through. What is the makeup of Congress, and how is it going to affect things? That's my last question for this interview.
Yeah, I will say it's majority right wing, different right wing factions. So I don't think, but I think it is complex. Obviously, like in the middle of a pandemic, trying to do something like that they did with Vizcarra kind of the ousting was very difficult. Because there is also a sense within the population of if Castillo is ousted, we are going to reinstate him. So people sometimes forget, but in Venezuela it was actually a coup d'état, and he was reimposed by the military. But the issue is, it's difficult, like, to know what the people in the military think. But like some veterans did endorse him. Like some veteran groups did endorse Castillo. So I think in some ways it is complex. Also, he has the support of the Ronderos, who are not a minor force. They have combated the shiny path. Despite that, like now the far right tries to use the Ronderos of being soft of the shiny pad or the lies of the shiny pad. They actually fought the shiny pad, so it's not that like they are, and they have tensions with Castillo. They feel that he's not listened to them, but I wouldn't be surprised if there is an attempt of ousting him. Like there is going to be a massive mobilizations and kind of resist any attempt. And I think the issue with the armed forces, in the trio of them, like the leadership is one thing, but the base is a very different thing. It's much more working class. So it's going to be a very difficult issue. I think Congress is going to play a crucial role, but at the same time, I don't expect I do expect that there is going to be much more it's going to depend much more on what Castillo does, and it doesn't seem clear now all of his paths, because if both Keiko and Cerrón are condemned and he's kind of free in some ways, it seems that he's going to turn to other positions, in some ways more radical, in some ways more moderate, because he's more radical in the sense of kind of I mean, finally, at the end of the day, Cerrón is a doctor. He studied medicine in Cuba, but he's a doctor. So he's a left winger, but he's a urban left winger, and Castillo is a rural teacher and a campesino. So in that sense, it has a different background, and I think that makes them fairly different characters, and I think that could be a central element within the future.
All right. Well, thank you for your time, Camilo. We'll probably have you back eventually, but I wanted to talk to you about the Castillo, because Americans tend to follow Latin American politics for elections and then forget about it. So I wanted to do a checkup, and if we talk about him again, it'll probably be in a year or two if we see any of the agenda happening and how Congress has interacted. I can tell you from the U.S. standpoint, the Biden administration has indicated concerns about the left in Latin America, but has not been focusing on Peru, has been focusing on the Workers' Party in Brazil, which I find interesting because while Obama was no friend of the Latin American left by any stretch of the imagination, he did have a good relationship with the Workers' Party in Brazil. And so the context has apparently changed, but I have not heard Peru come up a lot of this. So some of my friends have pointed out that there's like a Blackwater outpost in Peru, and then there is. I checked it; it does exist, but I don't see the U.S. being even that involved in Peruvian politics anytime real soon. It just doesn't seem like a major interest of ours for a variety of reasons. So,
you want I will elaborate a little bit on this.
Go ahead.
Yeah. In the days, a lot of kind of in the days of the impeachment, a lot of has been said. But actually, he has, had a reunion with the U.S. Embassy, and had, the U.S. Embassy has sent some donations to kind of help the infrastructure for hospitals, things like that. Let's remember the family of Castillo is evangelical. He is not evangelical, probably because his family is Catholic, so he goes. His parents still live.
And his wife's family is evangelical, right?
Yeah, his wife's family is evangelical. So evangelicals have a complex relation with the United States, even the left-wing evangelicals, because they don't like to condemn U.S. because they share this sense of messianism, which is something I probably at one point need to elaborate. I think that's messianism is I think what connects Latin America with the U.S., but at the same time is what makes Latin America very different than Canada, which is something that a lot of people like sometimes are confused. But in some ways, I think it was also seen with Correa. Correa, in some ways, was more technocratic than for example, Evo. And Correa also, I think he's evangelical, so he, on social issues, is more conservative than Evo, even if Evo makes more kind of weird remarks. I think also Correa and his relationship with Israel was quite curious, because a lot of evangelicals have quite curious views about Israel, and there is kind of or there was at least some kind of popular Zionism, which it is kind of weird, but there is some crypto Jews did formally the conversion to Judaism and moved to Israel. Crypto Jews curiously from Cajamarca, the region of Pedro Castillo, which is a region where a lot of things actually happen, and also we're mentioning a lot of members of his cabinet are. Two of the members of the cabinet actually are not just from Cajamarca, but from his province, Chota. Yeah, I mean it's very interesting to see those developments. But he hasn't sounded that much anti-US as others. I think he's much more moderate in the US. About the Blackwater outpost, I think it's really interesting. There were private military contractors from Peru and from Colombia, actually in Iraq. I think I'm not sure if in Afghanistan, but I think in Iraq there were. So probably that's the reason of the Blackwater outpost. I suppose it's not that difficult to find them out, but the national press at least not very well versed also in international issues, so I think they will be slightly confused about what to make of that. Actually, the one that mentioned that has been Jeremy Scahill. I mean, you will hear the stories from living in Peru, but kind of as Britain, like it's not being covered by the local press.
All right. Well, thank you for that. I hope that people find this clarifying. I'm gonna end the show. So our friend of the show, This is Revolution, we will no longer be in conflict with them, for those people trying to watch both right now. And this will probably be cleaned up and released as a podcast in the next 2 to 3 weeks. So thank you, Camilo. And like I said, you'll be on the show again. Everybody have a great day.